Blair Ruble is Vice President for Programs and Director of the Urban Sustainability Lab here at the Wilson Center. He joins us to discuss his new book, Performing Community, Essays on Community, Diversity, Inclusion, and the Performing Arts. Blair, welcome. Congratulations on this. We were just admiring this pretty book that is well designed and a lot of interesting information. You begin in the introduction with a quote from a theologian, from a British theologian, Philip Sheldrake. Cities have been the primary sites of human innovation and creativity, he goes on to say, but it doesn't happen by accident. It demands our commitment, a quest for shared values, and a measure of self-sacrifice. Can you unravel that for us? What are we talking about here?
I think the basic notion is we think of cities as being places of diversity and innovation and energy, and people are tossed together. But what he's really saying is there's an additional spark that has to go off, and that's the commitment of people to make a place work. And in the examples that I give in the book, there is always a moment at which someone, a leader, a community member, an official, someone makes that extra step so that the environment isn't enough. There has to be that human element.
So people do take it for granted sometimes. They just,
absolutely.
It just happens.
It just happens, right? You just toss enough people together and something good will happen. And if you really want to begin to have sustainable and sustained, ongoing, positive outcomes, it takes work.
Your ongoing interest in cities, would it be fair also to say you have a love of cities?
Yeah, cities captured my imagination.
And when did this happen? Where did this develop?
You know, it's interesting. I was a suburban kid, so it was when I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school in Toronto, and it was a great city, and it began to spark my interest. And then I did my dissertation research in what was then Leningrad, and trying to understand this very bizarre city that was somehow caught in the past as well as the present. It just made me think a lot about why it is people come to cities, what was it that made this city special, and it was really a turning point intellectually and emotionally for me.
It's really interesting. I did not know that you were a child of the suburbs. I would have guessed based on your interest in urban things and your love of the city that this was something, but maybe it takes an outsider to appreciate that coming in from the outside.
Well, I think, and I think when I went to Toronto, I understood that there were all around me things that I liked, and they were in one place. So how do you use them? And this goes actually back to an initial point. You have to make a commitment to use the city. It doesn't just happen.
Well, let's take the case study of your adopted hometown, the District of Columbia. Well, tell us about how it applies, or how does it rate in the notion of the quote, and how that you can't take this for granted, that you have to cultivate it in ways that are specific and real.
Well, I think at this moment, DC is a very important city for understanding what's happening in cities everywhere. It's going through a dramatic economic and demographic transition. It's going through rapid gentrification. And the question then becomes, what are we going to be left with? How much of the heritage of the past is going to be left? Street murals are being torn down. Businesses are going out of business. The historic African-American Main Street, U Street, the neighborhood is now 66% white. This is a neighborhood that 20 years ago was 77% African-American. So you have a city that's going through change, and therefore whatever is going to be retained from what Washington was in the past is going to take effort and commitment on people to do it. And what we see is, whether it's the mural artists or community groups or groups of former retired musicians, DC legendary musicians, you begin to look around and you realize that people understand that in all of this change, something is being lost, and they're working to try to sustain it.
So ultimately, do the arts become even more important in this equation of maintaining culture when you see this sort of chains and industrialization
I think
creates a sameness?
I think public art is important for a couple of reasons. One is it breaks down the sameness. Secondly, it becomes a point of sharing among diverse communities. DC has had for the past 2 years, and I think it's going to become an institution, every spring a funk parade. And funk is a kind of music that runs through all of DC music. And what happens is everybody likes it. So suddenly you have people coming together who would never get together for any other reason except on a nice spring day to be out on the streets and enjoy the same music. It's a little bit, actually, it's very natural, but it's also a little bit calculated. The organizers chose that genre because they knew it would relate to everyone, and what you have to do is to begin to create spaces where people have a positive shared experience. And then you begin to, then the local begins to define itself. And the performing arts are really a critical place to do that.
Have the arts always been sort of ahead of the curve in this notion of inclusiveness and diversity, and that performing arts almost demand a certain level of meritocracy?
Well, there's meritocracy.
Based on talent.
Meritocracy based on talent, and there are also communal activities. And, you know, human beings have gathered around the campfire to sing ever since
we could light a fire.
We could light a fire.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's natural. But the campfire experience is also important because being around the campfire is about circling in your community and keeping others out. So performing arts are like everything else. They can have different meanings in different contexts depending on how people want to use them.
One of the essays in here, more than one, you write about the city of Detroit, a city that certainly has encountered struggles. One of, I think, the essays is labeled Fight, Not Flight. What can we learn from Detroit about struggling cities and about the cities of the future?
Well, I think what's interesting, if you turn back the literature on cities, 30, 40 years, the notion was cities are dead, they're passé. Anybody who could would leave, and the people who can't leave, no one actually said we don't care about them.
Apparently,
right. But I think what's begun to happen, and for many reasons, is the point of decline turns around when there are enough people who just say, "This is where I want to be, and I'm not going to leave." And I think what we've seen in Detroit over the last half decade to decade is a growing number of people who just want to stay. And then they interact with the political process, obviously the bankruptcy process. You begin to get different changes, but they become the ballast for staying. There are interesting accounts of what happened after Katrina, when it wasn't the business community or even the politicians that brought Katrina back. It was really a number of primarily younger people who didn't want to lose the culture of New Orleans and stayed because of the music and the food and the art, and basically kept the city from falling apart. And then over time, I think New Orleans has more restaurants now than before Katrina. It begins to feed off itself. But for a city to come back and not just die, there has to be a moment at which some significant number of the people who are there are just saying, "This is my home and I'm not leaving."
Stand. Keepers of the Flame. Final quick thought, Blair, on the notion of community. You end with an essay about a personal experience where you encountered community in a real way. It's one of those words that maybe is overused and it can become trite or meaningless or even politically manipulative. We talk about, say, the Muslim community or the black community and assume some monolithic thinking. Tell us about your experience with community in this very real way.
Well, I have been sort of moving towards an increasingly cynical view of community, that is just a concept that gets overused. And then my wife suffered a stroke, and we found ourselves at the National Rehab Hospital here in Washington. And one day, the spinal injury unit had their annual picnic. And they have a lovely garden, and we were just the experience of being there. This wasn't a community of people who wanted to be there. This is a community of people full of painful history. And yet, within the gentle confines of this garden, with their loved ones and with the caregivers, something special began to emerge. And what I began to feel was that this feeling of sharing an experience was helping everybody there heal, because they were drawing on the strength and experience of others, be they loved ones or family or other patients. It was really almost mystical experience.
So you were experiencing the notion of community in a way you never had.
Exactly. Exactly. And it was really profoundly moving.
Well, thank you for the book. Thanks for your appearance today. And I want to tell people who are watching that if they'd like a copy, they can come to our website, and there's a PDF copy available. If you're old-fashioned and would like an actual print copy, an email to Urban Sustainability Program, and
At the Wilson Center.
you'll mail them one. Right. Thank you, Blair.
Okay, thank you.